Chapter 1. Find Richness in Simplicity. Live in a simple home. A.B. Mitford. I wonder whether any country in the world can show such snug and picturesque homesteads as those of the peasants of Japan. It is all so primitive, so innocent, and so well-to-do. A picture of that simple life of which so much is said in these days. A picture of content earned by honest work. A.B. Mitford, nobleman, diplomat, writer, visited Japan from Britain in 1866. Touched by the nostalgic rural landscapes during a riotous period in Japan. At the end of the Edo period, an intellectual young man of noble descent, glamorous but honest, arrived to work as a diplomat at the British Embassy in Japan. His name was A.B. Mitford. Upon arrival, Mitford immediately became friendly with the other staff and was affectionately called by the nickname Barty. Barty especially found many things in common with Ernest Satow, an interpreter who was 6 years younger than him, and they eventually became lifelong friends. He also became close with William Willis, a British doctor who was 29 years old at the time, and Charles Worgman, an artist. Barty and the two men did everything together. Barty resided mainly in Takanawa, Edo, but as a diplomat he visited many other places in Japan. He traveled to Osaka and Kyoto for Tokugawa Yoshinobu's shogun appointment ceremony. He also traveled to the Noto Peninsula, Hakodate, Nagasaki, and Osaka. He was deeply moved at the nostalgic rural landscapes and lifestyles of the people there, and left those very words quoted at the beginning of this section. Introduced Japanese folktales to the West and became a lover of Japan in both professional and private life. Barty was also very studious, and it is said that he immersed himself in learning Japanese at every spare moment. An intelligent individual to begin with, he progressed rapidly. It is said that in a mere year and a half after arriving in Japan, he was able to go about his duties without an interpreter. In his third year of staying in Japan, he had grown proficient enough to translate Japanese books into English. Barty introduced to the West fairy tales, such as the tongue-cut sparrow and the story of the old man who made withered trees to bloom, and tales of the 47 ronin, known in works as Chushingura, the treasury of loyal retainers. These stories were compiled and published in a book, Tales of Old Japan, which garnered much publicity in Britain. Although Barty was singularly focused on his duties as a diplomat and on learning Japanese, once his workday was over, he would sneak out of his quarters with Satow and Worgman into the nighttime streets in hopes of experiencing the entertainment of Edo firsthand. Nightlife was lively for commoners in the Edo period, and the city at night, no doubt, offered much to enjoy year-round. Barty enjoyed Japanese culture to its fullest, both in professional and private life, and became an avid lover of Japan. Barty's special privileges as a diplomat not only allowed him to meet farmers in rural areas and urban dwellers in Edo, he even had an audience with the shogun and emperor, enabling him to study many different facets of Japan at the same time. After a little over 3 years in Japan, Barty completed his appointment and returned to his home country of Britain. However, when he visited Japan again, 40 years later, he was greeted personally by the Emperor Meiji himself and had a joyful reunion with Tokugawa Yoshinobu, who was still living at the same time. From this, we can see the degree to which Barty had formed close friendships with authority figures in Japan. Barty recounts the following episode in his writings as something that moved him the most during his stay in Japan. At his welcoming ceremony, every lady in attendance had pinned a rose, the national flower of Britain, over her chest. Upon seeing this, Barty is said to have cried, "Could there be a more reserved yet deeply graceful form of hospitality? Would any other nation have imagined it?" Live a frugal but fulfilled life. Townsend Harris. Security for person and property, universal frugality and contentment seem to be the apparent condition of Japan at present. Townsend Harris, First Consul General to Japan. Visited Japan from the United States of America in 1856. Born into a poor household, he worked his way through school and established himself as an educator. Townsend arrived in Japan in the 19th century. New York at the time was receiving an influx of immigrants from Europe. Most of the staggering number of immigrants were impoverished, and their everyday life on new soil was full of hardships. Many of them settled in the slums of the Lower East Side and began their lives as day laborers. In the slums, there was chronic unemployment, disease, and crime, and social order was crumbling. On the opposite end, some people who had gotten their lives on track had left the slums and begun to build mansions in the luxury neighborhood of Fifth Avenue. They had joined the ranks of the wealthy. It wasn't long before a gap formed between the rich and the poor. From there, different cultures took root in the respective groups. Townsend's life was no different. He was born to immigrant parents from Britain and grew up forced to live in poverty. Unable to afford high school, he joined the family business once he graduated from middle school. However, Townsend had a strong sense of independence. In between his work, he frequented the library, where he taught himself French, Italian, and Spanish. Townsend developed a strong interest in extending education to the masses, given his own experience of growing up in a poor household and working to pay his way through school. Townsend completed his schooling and joined the New York City Board of Education, where he became president shortly thereafter. He went on to found the Free Academy of the City of New York, which became the City College of New York. He worked tirelessly in providing opportunities to immigrants in financial need and to working-class children so they could receive higher education. However, Townsend's move to provide free education was met with strong resistance. He eventually resigned from president of the board and changed careers to become a merchant. On a recommendation from an acquaintance in political and business circles, he later entered the world of politics at age 51. Before long, he was appointed as the first consul general to Japan by President Franklin, and he set off for Japan to conclude the Treaty of Amity and Commerce between Japan and the United States. Showed surprise at the lifestyles of commoners and also questioned the modernization of Japan. Townsend was already over 50 years old when he arrived in Japan for the first time. It seems that what he saw there was indeed very new to his eyes. For a man who had lived a life immersed in the harsh world of the working class, it would have come as a surprise how peacefully the laborers in Japan lived. Although they were not wealthy by any means, each individual was satisfied with his frugal life. It is the ideal for any country to secure the lives and property of its citizens and to gain its residents' satisfaction. To Townsend, it looked as if Japan had achieved this ideal, which prompted the words at the beginning of this section. In 1861, in his 6th year of living in Japan, Townsend's personal assistant, Hirschkin, was murdered. Townsend wrote the following in a letter to the British minister plenipotentiary. "I sometimes doubt whether the opening of Japan to foreign influences will promote the general happiness of this people." Townsend acted as a connecting bridge between Japan and the United States. The meaning of these words that he left still echoes significantly for those of us living in Japan today. Live with innocence. Henry Hirschkin. I who have admired the artlessness of your inhabitants, as well as their simple customs. Henry Hirschkin, interpreter, visited Japan from the United States of America in 1856. A multilingual diplomat who became popular for his cheerful personality. Henry was an American of Dutch origin and worked as an official at the American legation. As a natural-born European who had lived in Europe until the age of 20, he excelled in languages and was fluent in Dutch, as well as German and French, the languages of his neighboring countries. Henry was 24 years old when he arrived in Japan. An avid horseback rider, he procured a horse in Shimoda shortly after his arrival, and in every spare moment wore his riding clothes, which was formal wear, and rode away to various places with great eagerness. With an inherently cheerful and broad-minded personality, a deep understanding of Japanese matters, and a command of English and other European languages, Henry was prized and popular amongst foreigners staying in Edo. His competence was also remarkable amongst other diplomats at the American legation. When Harris, the consul general, fell ill during discussions of the Treaty of Amity and Commerce between Japan and the United States, Henry acted as his agent and negotiated with the Bakufu, the shogunate, directly. Also, when assistance was required in Dutch, the language of diplomacy for Japan at the time, Henry also assisted other countries' negotiations with Japan, thus making himself useful in many areas. Loved the simple honesty of the Japanese and was apprehensive of westernization, was ambushed and killed by xenophobes. However, one day in his 6th year of living in Japan, a tragedy befell Henry. As an avid rider, Henry often traveled everywhere on horseback, but some who were unaccepting of different things perhaps saw him as a nuisance. One winter evening, after a meal with the Prussian, German plenipotentiary, Henry was heading back to the American legation on horseback when he was ambushed and killed by 7 Ronin. It was said that Henry was accompanied by 7 guards at the time. However, the whole party was attacked, and Henry suffered a mortal wound. He was brought back on a stretcher to his quarters at Zenpukuji Temple, where surgeons from both German and British legations rushed to treat him as best they could. However, Henry passed away quietly on the following day. It is said that a large number of resident foreigners attended his funeral, and that the funeral procession was of a large scale rarely seen. It is telling of how much Henry was loved by those around him. Henry always gazed at Japan with an innocent heart. He wrote the following in his diary about a year after arriving in Japan. I, who have seen the abundance of your fertile fields, who have heard everywhere the happy laughter of your children, and have never been able to discern misery, I fear, oh my God, that this scene of happiness is coming to an end, and that the Occidental people will bring here their fatal vices. Henry loved the innocence and honesty of the Japanese people, and feared the loss of those qualities from westernization. In a cruel twist of fate, his life was ended by exclusionist Ronin who were trying to protect Japan from foreign invasion. One can only imagine the regret that he must have felt. Live with a modest sense of material satisfaction. Emile Guime. How the Japanese love nature. How well they know how to make use of natural beauty, peaceful, quiet, and happy lives. They do not hold unbefitting wants, nor are they competitive. How well they know to build lives filled with peaceful sensations and a modest sense of material satisfaction. Emile Guime, industrialist, visited Japan from France in 1876. A young industrialist aiming to contribute to society visits Japan seeking to understand religion. Emile was an intelligent young man who poured his energies into the arts and business and achieved success in his 20s. A philanthropist, unlike any other, Emile's desire to plant seeds of happiness in society was even stronger than his passion for academic and artistic pursuit. In other words, he strove to tread a path of contribution to society by devoting his life to all humankind. Emile's trip to Egypt when he was 29 years old became the turning point of his life. There, Emile encountered ancient Egypt's complex history, strict religion, majestic philosophy, and crude superstition, and was drawn into its mystique. Emile's inquisitive spirit eventually led him to Buddhism, and he began to set his sights on traveling to India, China, and Japan. With his noble aspiration of bringing happiness to the world, the young industrialist worked tirelessly for its realization and sought to acquire a true understanding of religion. He wanted to visit the lands where people lived by the teachings of each religion and wanted to interact directly with the residents. He wanted to visit temples and shrines and have discussions with the monks and philosophers. Emile was sure that this was what he needed at this moment in time. This was when Emile met Kuki Ryuichi, a Japanese living in Paris at the time. Emile passionately spoke of his aspirations to Kuki, who was at the time an art administrator with the Ministry of Education. Thanks to Kuki's facilitation, Emile was able to obtain a pathway to realize his dream of visiting Japan. Moved by the peaceful mentalities of the Japanese at a rest stop in Enoshima. Thus, Emile stepped on Japanese soil for the first time in his life at age 40. He was received with utmost hospitality at every destination. Emile, with his government-issued introduction letter and his naturally gentlemanly disposition, was welcomed everywhere he went. He wrote, "The residents welcome us with smiles on their lips and respond agreeably to the curiosity of us newcomers who have just landed." One day, while Emile visited Enoshima and stopped at a scenic resting place, he was moved by its comfort. The lines at the beginning of this section are what he penned about that occasion. From his experience of staying in Japan and through some contemplation, he arrived at this conclusion. These people understood the true value of learning and work, and worked humbly and diligently at those pursuits. In his observation of Japanese people and their peacefulness and quiet satisfaction, Emile saw the elevated mentality of finding satisfaction not in quantity, but in quality. Having satisfied his purpose, Emile returned to France, where he submitted a long and extensive report as a token of thanks to the Minister of Education. From this report, one can see that Emile was indeed a true elite of the highest class, a bona fide scholar and also a man of character. Emile went on to found the Guime Museum, named after himself, so that the public could see the materials and objects that he had spent his life collecting. It is said that Emile, upon discussion with the city of Paris, agreed to split the construction costs evenly between them, an amount of 1,590,000 francs. One can see the staggering scale of Emile's contribution to society as an individual.